Hi folks, Alex Creel here. You will have heard a lot about what's going on in bonds, and these yields are spiking up to over 5%. But the real truth of what is happening has been completely obscured in this media noise. And I'm going to explain as much as I can without using any jargon exactly what's going on. And what's really going on has everything to do with the Bank of England, what it's doing, selling these bonds, and everything to do with the fact that the Westminster Uniparty has increased the debt of the UK by about £1 trillion over the last 7 odd years, particularly during the insane lockdowns where we were borrowing billions per month and basically burning it. So they left a huge debt to pay with no corresponding assets created. That's really what's going on. And rather than talk about those things, the whole mainstream media distraction industry is pushing you off into completely ridiculous political infighting and fist waving, which would have absolutely no impact on the place that we find ourselves in today, which is completely irrelevant of who's in number 11 Downing Street. They are not the key players by a long way in how we got to where we are. And as I'm explaining this, please be aware of this caveat that this is not investment advice. This is a discussion on sort of macroeconomic issues. So I'm going to try in one simple chart to explain what's happening without making it overly complicated. So if you can see this chart, you should basically, stepping back a bit, get the feeling that you're looking at essentially a mirror image, and that's what this is. The more the Bank of England on this yellow line prints money and buys bonds with that money, the more it pushes down the yield of those bonds. Now, what that means is the more it buys, the higher the price of the bond. And it's just a fact of bonds that once they get expensive, that means the yield goes down. Now, I've written about this on Substack, so you can look at the details of what all that means. But the important thing is to see that the more money is being printed over all these years from 2008, the more the yields are artificially depressed at well below levels where they would be in a market environment, down to zero here. And then you can see that process basically in reverse, that as soon as the Bank of England stops printing money and buying bonds and starts selling them, the yield peaks up, and this is where we now are over five. They almost match perfectly. There's a bit of optical illusion here, but these things are kind of matched up at January 2022. So I've put that in arrows here. You can see that's the money printing, the highest in British history, which I'll show you on the next slide, and the simultaneous depression of yields, i.e., increasing the price of bonds to well beyond where they should be based on market forces. And they did that for a long time, essentially. They did it from 2008, and then they went sort of like crazy in 2020, printing more and more money. And then all you've got is the reverse of that process. And that's what's creating all the pandemonium at the moment. They stop pushing this funny money into the bond market and actually start selling bonds. And they've sold about 300 billion pounds worth of bonds in the last, whatever it is, couple of years. Um, and at the same time, the yield explodes. That's all that's going on. And in all the acres of coverage about Starmer, Burnham, Reeves, Badenoch, you will not hear a single word about what the Bank of England is up to. And I think you can understand from this chart that the Bank of England is the most important player in this whole situation at the moment, coupled with the fact that we added about £1 trillion worth of debt onto the balance sheet over about 7 years. Those are the two things that are driving this situation. Whichever puppet person happens to be sitting in 10 or 11 Downing Street at any one point in time is completely irrelevant to where we are now in terms of bonds being over 5% yield, i.e., the price of bonds falling. Um, so the important thing about the money printing is that the nobody will ever really tell you is the scale of the money printing has never ever been seen before in history, going back to 1697. Now, the Bank of England stopped producing this chart up to 2019. So I've added on 2020 to 2025 to show you this peak. 35% of GDP was the money printing. It's like miles above World War II, World War One, Napoleonic Wars. It is really unheard of. And, the idiots that we had in charge, they completely went crazy printing money. And this is unheard of. That is why your pound in the pocket is collapsing against things like gold and house prices and commodities and everything else. These guys have printed so much money, it's unbelievable. Again, something they don't really talk about. And this is all at the Bank of England. The Bank of England does this. And the Bank of England is a very powerful player in this situation now. And they are effectively more or less dominating markets. And most of our markets now are rigged. So interest rates are rigged, bond prices are rigged, currencies are rigged. And essentially, then the price of hard assets is also rigged because all the money printing leads to appreciation of house prices and gold prices and all those other things. So all of those markets are rigged, and Bank of England is the main player in rigging those markets. But when you hear the approved talking heads, who know all this, by the way, much better than I do, they will just come up with this is some Cambridge bigwig who's pushing on Starmer and Reeves. He's showing you a chart which covers 3 days. And we saw all that during COVID, people cherry picking a number and saying, look at this, there's no perspective, no nothing, no mention of the Bank of England, no mention of £1 trillion. He's pushing you into this completely dead end political infighting. That's where these guys want you. Same with this guy who I used to respect. He was a famous economist, he isn't a famous economist, but again, he's pushing the Starmer this, Reeves that, which is, and again, he knows this is about money printing, and then this is about mass sales of government bonds by the Bank of England, and he knows it's about debt. It's really the characters who just happen to be at number 11 Downing Street have absolutely no impact on that outcome at all. Um, so that those talking heads, plus the whole mainstream media, plus endless, breakfast shows, sofa sessions, it's all about this. It's all about completely irrelevant political infighting. If only we had Nigel there, this wouldn't happen. You could have Einstein in the Treasury now, and this would happen because what we're looking at is hard facts and economic reality that doesn't depend on which puppet happens to be in the revolving door of number 11 Downing Street at any one time. So this is all a dead end to prevent you really understanding what's actually going on. Um, again, the causes are the money printing is the immediate cause of why we are where we are. The other cause is the huge indebtedness, which was massively accelerated by lockdowns. And those problems have been built on top of a foundation of excessive government spending for quite some time, and that's gone up and up and up. So the important thing to remember, and this really irritates me when you see these so-called conservatives talking about being fiscally sensible and disciplined, and the recycled conservatives in the Reform Party. It was the conservatives that, together with Labour in the Uniparty, pushed us into lockdown. And in 1 month of May 2020, they printed or issued £62 billion of debts, IOUs, that have to be passed down to our children and grandchildren to pay. And that's equivalent to basically £1,000 a head, roughly, and 2.2 thousand per household. And we got nothing for that because that money was burned up in stupid furloughs, in pointless masks, and in duff PPE. That money created no assets; it just disappeared into thin air. But the debt was left, and that debt has to be paid. So it was a huge transfer of power from the people to the financiers. That's what these guys did. And the irony of it is, it's the left that always pushes for these big state interventions. and it's the left that actually are handing us over to the oligarchy because the oligarchy are making money on every leg of this madness, and the left helps them do that. They haven't quite figured that out yet, but they are the useful idiots of all of these scams. Um, Now, the actual bigger agenda of what these guys want is in this book called COVID-19: The Great Reset. You know, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a book, and it's all about this Malthusian sort of green madness. You know, we've got to stop eating meat. We shouldn't travel. We've got to stay in our little boxes. You know, everything needs to be online. There can't be any movement, and everything has to be monitored to make sure we comply with this crazy dystopian worldview that these guys have come up with. But the entire parasite class is bought into this vision, and they present it to you as caring for the planet, but ultimately it's about them dictating their completely dystopian and I would say anti-Christian worldview on you and punishing you if you don't comply with it. This is the same totalitarian lunacy that other movements have had in the past. One of the closest ones has been technocracy in the 1930s, quasi-fascist movement that was essentially disbanded, but very similar thinking. You know, we have the ultimate knowledge, we have the model, this is what we're doing. So like the carbon budgets are exactly that. And if you don't, and we're doing it because we love you and we love the planet, not because we're totalitarian psychos, which is really what they are. And then they manipulate people through their good nature, through their genuine concern for nature. They manipulate that and misuse that concern in order to advance their own devious agenda. That's what these guys are up to. And also, a big mystery to me was why, you know, supposedly businessmen who should be into free markets and capitalism are so heavily intertwined with these hardcore Marxists and socialists like Marianne Mazzucato. And the reason is because the communists want to expand the state, they want to throw state money at everything. And every time the state throws money at something, the predator class takes money away from the state and they make money. And that's been also the lesson of this quantitative easing in that chart. The Bank of England is going to lose something like £150 billion in that process. And that's about 2.5 times the defense budget. And that £150 billion turns up as a profit somewhere else with these vested interests. So they, of course, love it. Let the government intervene in everything. Let's have these PFI initiatives, and those will make us tons of money as well. So they want to keep the government spending. Of course, in COVID, 300 billion kind of went up in smoke. Vested interests made a lot of money from that. So they want to encourage the state to get bigger, and they want to concentrate power. They want this to be a dictatorship de facto, which is kind of where it's heading now. I think we can all sense, you know, the sort of what they call the algorithm ghetto being built around us. That's what all this stuff is about. All these monitors, all this digital ID. It's about building a system to enforce their worldview on us. That's why going into lockdown for people of that crazy mindset was seen as a good thing to do, because it helped advance the Great Reset. And it's literally in that book. So it's a totalitarian, essentially communist system with billionaires at the top of the food chain. And I've called it crony socialism. It's not crony capitalism, it's crony socialism. And then, you know, another reason why we're having all this distraction is people don't want, or the, you know, the powers that be don't want people asking too many questions about the money supply, what the Bank of England is up to, and how it managed to lose £150 billion. And, you know, there's some debate about where this quote came from, but leaving that aside, the actual quote is true. Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. That is a true statement, really. Controllers of the money supply really control everything. Central banks are, for the most part, nationalized, they're government owned, which in my book means nobody owns them, but people with the most amount of power actually control them. And if you look at the board membership and whatever else of those central banks, you get a bit of an idea about who actually is in control of all this thing. And it is a big system. It's not just one bank operating in independently in its independent country. All of these central banks are moving in total lockstep. This is Australia, Canada, England, Fed, and ECB. Mass money printing goes off on all of them, all at exactly the same time. They basically stop all at exactly the same time, and then they start running down or reversing the process of money printing by selling bonds almost all at exactly the same time. That is why bond prices are also pretty well moving in exact lockstep. So the levels of yield are slightly different between the UK and France. There's a little bit in it, but the actual shape of the curve is identical for all countries. So, whoever's in charge of this system makes sure it's very well coordinated. And of course, knowing what's happening here gives you unlimited ability to make money in all of those markets because most of them now, the biggest player is the central bank. So, as I said, we don't have really any free markets in financial assets. They're kind of dominated by central bank activity, and whoever knows what's going on there or controls it has a very significant competitive advantage. Um, and you can see, what money printing actually does. The only thing you can say for sure is it massively increases the wealth of the wealthy. This is the top 0.1% in the US. This is their net worth, and this is what happened to it as the Fed started printing money. I mean, you couldn't possibly really get a closer correlation than this. And that's because money printing pushes up the value of bonds, as we discussed, and the yields go down, and it pushes up the price of equity, which I think is what these guys are really interested in. Equity prices is actually their target. I think everything else is a smoke screen. And the more is printed, the richer they get, and the higher the wealth concentration, which also suits them just fine. So all of the stuff I've heard about, the trickle down effect or the knock on benefits, I think it's all completely bogus. It's all based on modeling. So, hopefully by the end of COVID, people have realized these models just spit out what people want them to spit out. I don't believe any of it. And I can see in front of my own eyes. The only thing money printing does for absolute certain is increase the wealth of the wealthy. And I think that is the whole purpose, really, of it. Everything else is secondary. And I've written about this in this Substack, The Great Lockdown Swindle. Um, I thought it was pretty interesting. So, anyway, my position now is this is the reality we're dealing with now. We still have to survive financially. We've got shark infested waters, manipulated markets, and a group of extremely wealthy people sitting at the top of this food chain, and we have to navigate ourselves through these waters. Now, one thing for free people will know that I've been encouraging people to stay away from government debt for many years now, and you've seen this latest collapse in price, which means an increase in yield. So anyone that listened to what I was saying will have avoided that particular bullet. There's plenty of other bullets out there, and I'm negotiating my own way around those obstacles. And that's what I've done actually all my life in my career. But through a long chain of events, I'm able to do that now and share that work with other people. So, if you're invested, you need to be also thinking quite carefully about what's going on. So I think, a few hours, if you invest a few hours now, that could potentially have a pretty significant knock-on effect for a couple of decades into retirement, because you very much want to avoid these bullets. And in an ideal situation, at least, you should stay ahead of inflation, because if you're not able to do that, your real purchasing power will get eroded essentially in this kind of environment. So for anyone that's in that situation, drop me an email and we can talk about it. And as I mentioned in the caveat, that's not investment advice. That is about what's happening in the economy generally. I've got some interesting substacks about all of these things. And I wanted just to draw people's attention to this omnivore one. I'm not a black pillar. who's going to sit there and say everything's terrible, let's walk away into the woods. There's a lot people can do to actually try and prevent this dystopia being implemented. And I think it's on all of us to prevent it in every possible opportunity to stick in the wheels and prevent this kind of Marxist, Gaia worshipping Malthusian madness taking over our countries. It already is a fair way towards doing that. So there's lots of initiatives in here. There's any number, I mean, probably literally hundreds of, industry groups, libertarian parties, local action groups that you can get involved in. So I definitely believe that's worthwhile. As I said, I'm not a black pillar, but I am also at the same time a realist and understanding that we need to navigate financially through what we have. We're not going to change that in a hurry, so we need to understand what's going on and sort of move through those troubled waters. And I've written quite a lot of this up into a Substack, and these last two, you'll find a lot more material in there if you're interested. And I hope you found this interesting, and best of luck, and hopefully I'll speak to some of you in due course. Okay, thanks. Bye.